Welcome to another session of the Learner's Mindset. I'm Dr. Dwayne Hrapnick.
And I'm Dr. Talissa Thibodeau.
And today we're going to be taking a look at the notion of ownership of the learning. How does the student take ownership? How do you give that student ownership? How much control do you give up? All these sorts of things that are going to be extremely important. And to maybe set the context, for those of you who are not overly familiar with the constructivists that we are, or that perspective, people like us, people like Dewey and Piaget and Bruner, have all held that the learner is responsible for taking ownership of their learning by making those meaningful connections. And Mortimer Adler, for example, likened the learner to a plant, and he likened learning to something being organic, and the teacher was like a farmer, and the teacher nurtured the plant, created the right type of environment, but the plant had to grow. He also likened the learning environment to that of a doctor and the patient, where the doctor creates the circumstances, maybe sets the bone, and then the patient is the one who does the healing. So the learning is the responsibility of the learner. But to make that happen, you've got to give the learner ownership of the learning. So this is where we're going today. Well, I'll turn it over to you, because I know you and I talk about this an awful lot, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about our starting point.
Yeah, I think that ownership of the learning does happen here. It has to happen inside the learner itself. So it's interesting, the perspective and the context you set up, because I notice oftentimes when we're working with students, students in our program especially, that really take ownership of the learning, go all out, okay? They actually are thinking of A through Z and how it's going to impact me and others and students, and you know, it's really amazing to watch that happen. But then again, you know, if we struggle to take that ownership, and sometimes that happens when maybe we're doing something we don't always like to do. You know, when we struggle, it's like a task or a job. You know, it's like, oh, it's difficult. You know, difficult to get through. But once we make that step over into ownership and really taking the reins and moving forward with our ideas and kind of putting that enthusiasm behind it and you know, getting excited about what we're doing, or taking that ownership, everything changes. The whole game changes. Learning happens, and that deeper learning happens. So I find when, you know, folks take ownership, deeper learning occurs. So when we go back to learner's mindset, to me, ownership is one big piece of having that learner's mindset, and that's really causing us to kind of step back a little bit and let the learner kind of see these things for themselves and really understand that what they're doing makes a difference, and it gives them that opportunity to work on something that's significant to them when they take that ownership. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. You said something that I think is really significant. You said, you know, we step back a little bit and let the learner really engage in those ideas. I'd almost argue that we step back enough to get out of the way and let the learner learn, as opposed to requiring the learner to share information back or give us back what we expect of them. And when the student does take that ownership and they engage, it makes a very, very significant difference. People like Mesereau and Albert Bandura, the self-efficacy advocate, would argue that when a person enters into that aspect of ownership of their learning and the circumstances that they're in, that learning then becomes transformational. Mesereau, in particular, in his work, talks about transformational learning, and he also argues that when a learner can orally talk about what it is they're learning, or write about that experience and reflect back. So from a metacognitive perspective, thinking about learning, when they do that, it changes things. I would argue then is that that's when you can never take it away from them. Right? That's when they get it. That's when it's theirs. And in terms of assessing learning, or assessing what a learner has done, when learners hit that point where they've taken that ownership and they create something, they build something, they design something, they assemble something, and they've got that pride of ownership, wow, it's theirs. That you then know that you've achieved that goal of letting go of enough control to allow that learner to come in and take that ownership and to really engage. It's exciting to see that, and I don't think we do that often enough. And part of the problem with that is that our systemically, you know, our system of education is really about preparing people, getting them to the next level, and there's standards that have to be met, and so you're checking things off the list. And we have a tendency to lose sight of the fact that learning isn't about checking that off the list. Learning is about that struggle. Learning is about dealing with that frustration. Learning is recognizing that it didn't work the first time, and you've got to try again. You fail forward. That's a term that we use a lot. So, you know, that ownership of learning is really there's so much involved, so much involved.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how important it is for us to act as mentor, coach, facilitator, guide, and how, you know, students might question, you know, if you step back this much, how much freedom do I have? Is it almost too much freedom? But when you tie it back to the perspective of you were given enough freedom to work on an authentic project that was going to change the teaching and learning landscape in your organization, or aim to do that, and maybe you're moving forward with an innovative idea, you know, we might be able to, we're going to help you, coach you, and guide you, but at the same time, you have to be the one that sees this is working, this is not working. Maybe I didn't articulate my vision the way I thought I did. Maybe I didn't actually use some of the influencer model or 4DX strategies that I've learned or read about, and some of the leadership traits that I could have. So how do I tweak, modify, mold, and adjust what I'm doing to get where I want to be, or to move this move this innovative idea forward? That's all part of the learning process. That's part of, you know, when you dip into ownership, you start thinking about self-regulated learning. When folks are leading an innovation plan, or they're excited about something, maybe they're working on a you know, communities of practice, you know, there's opportunities all the time that we can take and take advantage of. But we have to always step back and take a look and realize what we're doing is going to impact other folks. You know, what is the biggest impact we can make? So when you, Dr. Krafnick, and myself come alongside students and help them sort of see, you know, opportunities for them to take that ownership, and then give them that freedom to make those decisions and changes, I think this is where ownership starts to take place. Because now, you know, here I am, the student, I'm going to make a big change in a big way, or these are my plans, this is what I want to do. You know, how is this going to affect other people? And that's the point at which they start to self-regulate, sort of self-direct, and ownership takes place. Now I'm in charge of making the decisions, and I'm going to see how that impacts other people. So we have to give them that opportunity. We have to step back a little bit and be less prescriptive, so that they can learn through that change process. Change is part of leadership. And when you're working through change, you're taking ownership and making decisions that are going to affect you and other people, especially our students. And their learning is number one as educators.
I think you've really hit some key points here that, you know, we have to step back, we have to facilitate, and the learners have to really engage in that ownership. And in the past several years that we've been running the Digital Learning and Leading program, and I've had the absolute phenomenal honor of facilitating the capstone course, and we get to see the reflective analysis of the experiences that students have gone through. One of the most consistent themes that we see coming out of that reflection is that learners wish they would have engaged or taken ownership sooner. If there was a regret that they had, they might have waited, you know, until, if they would have taken ownership sooner and really trusted the system, or trusted us as instructors, and trusted the fact that within the DLL program and within the COVA approach, you know, that we really are giving them choice, ownership, and voice through that authentic learning opportunity. When they did take ownership, it changed everything. And so if there is a regret, now, when I hear that, I recognize that we have a challenge. because a lot of our educational system is designed based on standards and curriculum and meeting certain standards and getting people to the next level. And so the opportunity to take ownership doesn't happen often enough. You know, even when we implement project-based learning, there's a tendency to use project-based learning in our learning environments, and it ends up being thematic, and the projects have to fit within a very slim constraint. Now, constraints are okay. You want constraints. You do want to have those constraints because they do contribute to creativity, and working within constraints is extremely important. And we recognize that in the work, the new culture of learning. But often the constraints that students are faced is they've got a choice between 2 or 3 little options. Well, that's not just constraints. You're limited. So then you don't really get to take ownership, because the ownership has to be something that you want to own. And so I think another reflection that I've seen with the students is that especially the students who are teachers, because only half of our students are actual teachers. A lot of our other students in the program come from other disciplines, but the students who are teachers recognize that when they really let go and let the learner do something and have that project that is theirs, they really own it, and it forces the instructor to actually learn a little bit about the topic that the student might be working on, and it forces the instructor to sort of move out of their comfort zone, because you are facilitating maybe learning that is happening in an area that you're not an expert. But when you do that, when you allow that learner to really take ownership, and the authentic learning opportunity is authentic to the learner, it's theirs, that ownership that the learner has makes all the difference in the world. And then when our educators in the DLL program recognize that key point, they had to let go. They had to let go enough to allow the learner to go down that path, and to recognize, guess what? They are going to fail. They're going to stumble. They're going to get annoyed. They're going to get frustrated. But that's okay, because you come alongside them and you encourage and support and let them know that, hey, listen, the quicker you fail, the sooner you're going to fix the mistake and move on to the next thing. So I think it's really important that they see that. But we don't do this enough. We do it in the DLL program, but I don't think we do it enough in other areas. What are your thoughts on that?
Not great, that's life. We make decisions constantly, and we have to own our decisions and move forward with them. That's life. That's an authentic context, what you're talking about. You couldn't have said it better. There's this notion, and I read quite a bit about it in the courses and discussion boards, that there's quite a bit of fear of teachers not having control over what the students are doing. And I'll often see and read students lament that I can't get other teachers to get on board with using or implementing technology, because they're fearful that if they let go of a little bit of control, they're going to lose control completely. When in all actuality, if you set up a significant learning environment where the learner is working on something authentic and important to them, they have a little bit of opportunity there for choice, ownership, and voice in that authentic learning opportunity, whatever that may be. Maybe they come together and they collaborate on a group project and they build something meaningful for a high school Spanish class. I mean, it's something that they come together and they do, and each person has a part or a piece of that. These kids actually supersede the expectations that were there in the first place. And they actually meet all the standards, the content and curriculum that was set there to begin with, and then some, because we just shift our focus just a little bit and allow them a little bit of freedom to go about and almost teach themselves as they're learning, right? And as they're working on projects together and or by themselves, I mean, whether they're doing an individual or a group project. So it all, to me, goes back to the authentic context. If we want our students to take ownership of what they're doing, they have to have opportunities to realize the work they're doing is, one, important, two, that is significant to them, and it adds to their interests and their pocket of experience and what they really want to do. But everyone wants to be part of something bigger than themselves. And so, three, it needs to add to a larger, broader context. I think we need to sometimes step back and say, what am I really doing? Am I teaching learners, or am I teaching standards? Am I teaching kids who are going to go out into the real world and actually make some of those changes and walk through the learning process and have that opportunity to take ownership and learn as they go? Or am I telling them what they need to know and then repackage this up for me, and so that I know that you've learned the content and the material? I would suggest the latter is better, simply because I think in my own world, if I'm doing something and I'm learning, things that are just, if my husband, okay, let me give you a real world example. My husband's back there making, a chicken coop, and he's having his fun. He's out there, building coops and chicken tractors. If you're a farmer, you know what a chicken tractor is. And I don't have much interest in that. So if he's going to ask me to go back there and bang a few hammers, now, oh, okay, this is great, wonderful for you. But, it maybe didn't have a big impact on me. Now, I come back here and I do videos like this, and I think about educators. That is important to me. I take ownership of this. And my husband takes ownership of that. Of building the chicken coops and the tractors and farming and raising chickens. And, it's our own interests. So can we really put students in a tube and say, this is important, learn this stuff, when their interests are in different directions?
Well, I think you've touched on something, again, that is so important. And I'm going to bring in an example from one of our digital learning and leading students. It was a recent reflection that I read, and I had a conversation with her about this. And she is a middle school teacher, and she found that in her blended learning environment, which was part of her innovation plan, that she very quickly realized some of the stock video and some of the stock material that met the standards really wasn't engaging enough for the learners. When she recognized that it was better for her to start to create her own videos and to focus on the things that were really important to help the learners to become who they needed to become, some of the students in the class picked up on her making the videos, and they immediately said, well, can we help? And within a matter of a few days, a week or so, a couple of weeks, the students got engaged in creating the videos. And she found that some of the most disruptive students that she had were actually interested in creating the videos. And by allowing them to take ownership of that creation process, she showed them respect that they had the capability to make a difference, and the discipline issues went away. Her classroom became noisy and loud, but there were no longer any discipline issues. People weren't being disrespectful because she respected them and trusted them to do the things that were necessary. And when students take ownership and they're creating and they're building and they're doing something that's meaningful to them, and they can share it with others, that's the key thing. We're social beings. We want to share what we've learned with others when we bring others into the process. And then the collaboration that happened, you had, again, we're talking middle school. These can be tough kids to work with, right? They all have attitudes. If you haven't been in that, well, actually everybody knows somebody in middle school, right? You understand the attitudes. And she found that the attitudes shifted and the students were working together, and it was just a night and day difference. And then she had one of her colleagues take a look at what she was doing, and he started to incorporate some of the things that she was doing, and it changed the behavioral problems in the classroom. So sometimes when we actually step back a little bit, respect the learner enough to recognize what they're doing is important and authentic to them. In your example with your husband, hey, that chicken coop, that's important. Building it, there's certain things that are important. By respecting what he's doing, you're acknowledging that is important. And when you do that, that's what we want as human beings. We're social. We appreciate that. So when we do that in the classroom, when we see what a learner is doing that is real and genuine to them, we respect that. Not only respect it, but come alongside and encourage, support, and say, how can we help? And say, this is great. You want to share this with even more people. It means that we're actually looking far enough down the road to see who this learner is going to become, as opposed to what do we want this learner to be able to regurgitate. So it really makes a world of difference. And I think that little bit of respect makes a world of difference as well.
I just want to capitalize on something that you said. Sometimes I think folks have a little bit of fear that if their students take on too much ownership, they'll lose that control. But if you can just tilt and listen to what we had to say here in this learner's mindset discussion, tilt in your head into the direction of this student has something that's important to them, is passionate, that they are passionate about. They're going to make what we're learning come to life for themselves. And this is going to be socially, it's going to be shared among other students. Other students are going to take watch that child come alive, or that middle schooler come alive whenever they're excited about what they're doing, that's not something to fear. Let the kid take a little bit of that ownership, see where he goes with it. Then come back with something much larger than you ever expected. The learning is going to go deeper. They start finding a passion and interest and a pathway for themselves. Even those kids who have those behavior management issues, that we can, as teachers, and I can say this as having been in the classroom 11 years, we can step back a little bit and allow these kids to explore, experiment, have some imagination and creativity. That's okay. They're going to learn more than what you expected in the first place if they go down the authentic context pathway and are given a little bit of freedom to learn.
In addition to that little bit of freedom to learn, I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that we have to give them enough freedom to fail. And what I mean by that is we don't want to have people be totally destroyed by failure. No, we don't want that. But what I mean is there are times when life presents some challenges, and there's only lessons that can be learned by making a few mistakes, and then by recognizing through an authentic opportunity that, yeah, that was a lesson that I had to actually learn on my own. I had to experience it. I had to feel that. I had to see that. I had to be immersed in that to recognize, yeah, I'm not going to be doing that down the road. But there are certain lessons you don't learn unless you experience them. So we do have a tendency to try and prevent failure from happening, when actually failing and failing forward, and errors and error recognition and being able to making those adjustments are instrumental for learning. So I think I think the authentic learning opportunities and that ownership that comes from that is extremely important in terms of helping people to learn. There is another fear. There is another fear that I think we have to talk about. We talked about a couple of fears that students have. So as an instructor in this master's program that we have, some of our students have a fear of, well, what is it going to take for me to get the A? I'm afraid, I know how the system works. I know if you tell me what you're going to give me, I'll give you exactly what you want, professor. So when students are asked to do something that is real and authentic and to take ownership, they're automatically concerned about grades. Well, I'm used to getting the A, and now I don't know how the system works. How do we deal with that? How do you lessen those fears? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think of John C. Maxwell's work, and I was thinking about this back when you were talking about failing forward. And he says in his text, get a new definition of failure. Rewrite your definition of what failure actually means. So, and by that he says, failure is an incident. It happens once. It doesn't define you. Okay, so anything below an A for some students, I failed. And I encourage them when I teach, the first course of the program, I go through some failing forward strategies. I talk a bit about, you really need to take a look at what you're defining yourself by. Are you defining yourself by anything less than an A and calling that a failure? Are you taking those authentic learning opportunities you've had and turn those challenges, those challenges you've experienced into opportunities to grow? What is your definition of failing? And all of that comes together. So I really get them to start thinking about how they're using a grade to define who they are and getting away from that, because that goes back to Thorndikean standardization practices of everyone has to be a certain way.
It also reinforces the false notion of the fixed mindset. So if you think of Carol Dweck's work, right? So this idea that you're defined by your output, your results, is really something of the fixed mindset. Whereas with a growth mindset, there's that recognition that a challenge, or not being at the top of the stack, so to speak, is just part of the process. And I think it's really important as instructors. What we do when we're assessing students is that we're always providing feed forward. So rather than saying what a student has done wrong, you're always instructing, say, listen, this is a great idea you have here. You've started this project very, very well. This blended learning initiative, I think, is going to work exceptionally well. You've got a station rotation model that is useful. But some of the constraints that you've put in here will prevent students from taking ownership. You might need to look at, letting the students be a bit more engaged in these areas. So you point to things that can be even better. You know, because quite often students are their biggest critics, and they often know what's not going to work. And so you point to the things that can be improved, because you always want to build on that solid foundation. And so when you incorporate, you know, that notion of failing forward, and reinforcing the growth mindset, and using positive feed forward and feedback, then learning really becomes a wonderful experience. That still is a little frustrating, and that's a little annoying, you know. And there's a myth, I think, that we perpetuate, that learning should be a really easy thing, and if you don't find it easy, well, there's something wrong. No, learning can be frustrating. That's part of the process. We're human entities, you know. A little bit of struggle, I think, is important in that learning process. And I think we do our learners a disservice if we try to take total ownership and shield them from the reality of the real world.
You make a good point there, because I think about, if we take full ownership of what they're doing, we actually own their work, right? We don't want that to happen. That's the opposite of what we want to happen. So when I go back and I think about some of the feed forward that I give students in courses, I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm probing their thinking. I'm not necessarily probing what you're doing. I'm getting them to think, how can I maximize the benefits, or make this more significant if I just tweak it this way, or look at it from this perspective. And that is, I think, building opportunities for them to kind of put their own gauge on their progress, and you know, kind of tapping into, how did this decision I made impact these students, or will impact these students, or you know, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to be a trainer, for a district trainer, and I'm going to share, how did I actually communicate a message? Did I just teach them, or did I actually move them? Head won't go where the heart hasn't been. You know, so I'm always thinking about giving those feed forward strategies to help them as they learn, and you know, providing those opportunities and saying, you know, failing forward is okay. If I have nowhere, me as an instructor, if I have nowhere to climb to and I'm at the top, I feel like I'm not making progress, because I know there are so many perspectives all over this world that I could gain from. And I try to do that. I try to model what I ask my students to do as well. You know, seek other people's thoughts about things, you know, come alongside other people, get others' opinions, ask your students, what do they care about? You know, get multiple perspectives and pull them together, and make that kind of your little piece, your little dent, and then move forward with your plans, you know, and you'll learn failing forward. You'll learn how to turn challenges into opportunities for growth. You know, so learning is not easy. It's messy.
It is messy, and I think it's really important, as we have these conversations, to reinforce a couple of fundamental ideas. What you and I are talking about is a very different aspect of being a teacher. We're talking about being a facilitator. So in a very traditional sense, teachers are often viewed as a gatekeeper, because they're the ones who affirm whether or not the student is right or wrong. But what we're talking about is that we're no longer taking on that role of being a gatekeeper. We're no longer taking on that role of, you know, affirming right or wrong. But what we're talking about is coming alongside and encouraging and supporting, and letting the learner know that our role as a facilitator is to help them be successful, is to help them make the changes and the adjustments to the work that they're doing, so that they can be even more effective. And that facilitation role of the instructor is very, very different. And it takes a little while for learners to get used to that and to trust that, because for the most part, we don't do a lot of that in other programs. We should do a little bit more. And actually, you know what, it's almost going back to, you know, kindergarten. I think some of the most impactful students that we've had in the program are the ones who teach kindergarten grade 1, because you still are allowed to allow kids to be kids in kindergarten grade 1, and you can do real things, and you get to play around, and you get to have some fun, because that's still part of the program. And I find that as our students move up, and we have students who are teaching middle school and high school, or we have students who are teaching at the higher education level, and the stakes are much higher and the standards come into play, that the authenticity of learning goes away. and it simply becomes more of a regurgitation of facts and information and checking boxes off so that the credential can be assigned. And so, there's a lot of lessons to be learned about this idea that everything I learned in kindergarten. If you remember that series of books, I think there's some merit in that sense that, learning at that fundamental level, if you really take a look at who we are as human beings and how we really, really learn, that doesn't really change. The system of education changes, but humans, we learn. We learn by doing, we learn by engaging, we learn by coming together and collaborating, we learn by creating, we learn by designing, we learn by stumbling, by fumbling, by failing. We learn. We are constructivists by nature, and so when the system moves us away from that, I think it's less effective. Now, most students get used to it, and they know how the system works. And so here you run into instructors like us who are going back to this constructivist perspective that has always been there. I think it can be challenging. So the fear of grades, the fear of failing, it's our responsibility, if we're doing constructivist-based learning like we are, to actually put our learners' minds at ease that it's going to be okay. Even though you do fail on an assignment or you fail on the project, that doesn't necessarily mean you haven't learned the lessons, and you can still do fine on the assignment itself, because the assignment is really significant in the sense of what it is that you're going to be doing in the real context.
Yeah, I think we've summed this up pretty clearly, and I'm happy with this conversation that we've had. I don't really have other comments to make at this time. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we've hit a lot of the key things, and it's interesting as we do more and more of these conversations, just to let the people who are watching know, we've actually stopped doing talking points, and this is really candid. This is where we live. This is what we're thinking about, and I always find it exciting. Actually, we had probably an equivalent conversation like this even before we started today. So we really should be recording our conversations earlier. Yeah, I think we covered it all, and I'm looking forward to addressing issues of choice and the voice perspective, and more specific aspects of authentic learning as well in future discussions. And as we talked about prior to our conversation here, we are going to have to do another conversational perspective on that whole COVA perspective, the COVA framework in terms of choice, ownership, and voice, as well as the creating significant learning environments. Lots of discussions to follow. But yeah, I think we've done a wonderful job with the ownership part. I think we've owned it. I couldn't resist.
I was just thinking, what a good, crucial conversation this was. An open dialogue, free flow of meaning, right?
Yeah, it's wonderful. Listen, let's sign off then and say goodbye to everyone, and I look forward to our next conversation. Take care.